the average per square foot
Oh,
price
so I do that and then press the
of
button.
an apartment went up 158%. Right? Over a 5-year period, the sales price, the market sales price of a unit went up 158%. That is a hell of a number, and it's especially a hell of a number because most of those units are going to be rent stabilized. Right? And so what we know is that there has been this wave over the last 10 years where developers are buying rent-stabilized apartments, not with the intention of managing them modestly and appropriately based on the existing residents who are there, but based on the expectation of pushing out the rent-stabilized tenants through various loopholes in the law, right? And then being able to, when the apartment is vacant, quickly overnight to take the rent from, an affordable $800, $600, whatever it is, to $2,500 or $3,000. That's what I think when you look at that, that fact that there's been a 158% increase in the per square foot price. That's what it means. That's speculation, and speculation in a neighborhood like this, where most of the residents are rent stabilized, speculation has victims, right? So I suspect that's why most people are here today. The other thing that jumped out at me, and so we can sort of talk a bit later about what some of the solutions are on that, and there really are some important policy things that this administration has committed to do that we can make them do, actually just to help deal with that problem. The other thing that jumps out here is that in this neighborhood, there's, as Gail said, there's a whole lot of tax credit subsidized buildings that were built, 30 years ago, 28 years ago, where their affordability restrictions are set to expire. There was a lot of distressed housing here back, 20, 30 years ago. A lot of that was, was built in, was rehab. That was great, but they didn't set the affordability restrictions at more than 20 or 30 years. And starting next year, especially in this neighborhood, a lot of that affordability is about to expire. And so, as a general rule, if it was a not-for-profit developer, they're going to keep it affordable because their mission is to bring it back into affordability, to renew the abatement, to keep it going as affordable housing. If it was a for-profit affordable housing developer, even if they were using government-backed sort of subsidy, there's a good chance that in a short period of time they're going to take that building to the market. That's kind of a looming crisis. The issue sort of that's being one of the headlines of this panel really is about zoning, inclusionary housing. And I think that's particularly relevant for East Harlem, which has been mentioned as one of those sites, one of those neighborhoods that's going to have a rezoning. So in some ways, the conversation about inclusionary housing is an incredibly important one, and in some ways it's not. Inclusionary housing is not a silver bullet, right? It is not going to single-handedly create enough affordable housing that is going to resolve any of the serious problems we have. What it can do, if it's well applied, is to control some of the market forces and to try to have a neighborhood voice determining what's the balance of new market rate housing that's built, what's the balance of new affordable housing that's required there, and how deeply affordable that will be. It's a trade-off, right? If you upzone a neighborhood and you bring in a hell of a lot of new market rate housing, that creates a lot of displacement pressure, right? That sort of concentrates a lot of market rate residents, and that concentrates that displacement pressure. If in that new housing, right, you are mandatorily requiring a lot of sort of meaningful percentage of genuinely affordable housing, that can offset the displacement pressure and even maybe improve the affordability of the neighborhood. But you have to find that balance. If the balance is wrong, it's a net loss for the neighborhood. If the balance is right, it's a net gain for the neighborhood. In East Harlem, there was a long community process over the last year that the community board and the council members led that came up with sort of a very well
and the borough president.
And the borough president. led by the brilliant leadership of the borough president. They came up with sort of a very sort of thoughtful and strong plan that proposed that if there is going to be an upzoning, that between the private sites and the publicly held sites, that 50% of the housing has to be affordable, and that at least 20% of that affordable housing has to be affordable at genuinely low levels, like the families that are earning 30% of the Airbnb income. Right? So that was a long process. It was very involved by the folks and activists in the neighborhood. That might be the right balance. Right? That is sort of a worthwhile goal to put for. That might be the right balance in the neighborhood. But the City Planning Commission administration still hasn't actually committed, hasn't accepted that plan, let alone committed the resources to implement it. So it's a good, strong plan with a good, strong process, but it's really now just the starting point is community engagement to actually make them do it, right? So,
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Tim Collins, who is an attorney in New York. He's one of the former head of the Rent Guidelines Board. I know he's going to talk a little bit about preservation and other aspects of this huge topic, but I do want you to know that he's a star among stars in terms of attorneys who care about all of us and the tenant movement in the city of New York. Tim Collins.
Thank you very much. Okay, I guess I'll step out as well. Thank you, first of all, to Palante for another wonderful conference. They seem to be getting bigger every year, and I hope they continue to get bigger. This should be a happening 3, 4, 5 years down the line. 1,000 people, 2,000 people. It's very important that people be involved with the complex issues relating to how their housing is supplied and why it costs so much. I want to speak somewhat basically, and I will disagree with the direction and sentiments of some people on this panel, and perhaps even Gail. That's democracy, as much as I love it, respect Gail, because I know she's a wonderful. But I want to first of all put some historic perspective. A couple of hundred years ago, we'd be standing in a pasture with cows. This was farmland. Okay? People eventually moved into Harlem, settled it, built it. 100 years ago, we'd be on the cusp of the Harlem Renaissance. A lot of brownstones going up. This area becoming, part of what it is today. But a lot of the large modern buildings, including this one, would be here. 100 years from now, Harlem will look very different than it does today. That's inevitable. We can't preserve it forever. And as much as we'd like to perhaps be sitting around a picnic table under an old oak tree, having our discussion, that would be impracticable. We had to move forward. We had to build housing. We will continue to have to build housing. We are right now on the cusp of a perfect storm. We've been talking about a housing affordability crisis. I've been talking about it for 30 years. We're now looking at a housing affordability disaster. What's happened in the city is the population has gone up. We're now at 8.5 million people. And the incomers in the city are different than the incomers, the newcomers who were coming in the 70s and 80s. There were about 3 million foreign-born people in the city who came in 30, 40 years ago. Many of them low income, helped made the city what it is, built the city. Many of them live here in Harlem. But today there is a larger portion of domestic newcomers coming in. College educated, people who are used to and demand nice housing and have a greater ability to pay for it. And they are pushing up the prices. In addition to this, 2008 flattened new housing permits. So while a lot of housing continued to come online because it started earlier, we hit a low point because of the effects of the recession. So we don't have a lot of stuff coming online, but I'm optimistic that that will pick up again. The signs of the housing affordability crisis are clear. Record homelessness, 57,000 people in city shelter, basically a small city. And that's just city shelter, that's not all of the full documentation at all. Rent burdens, record levels. 55% of the city's residents paying over 30% of their income in rent. Some of them many of them paying over, about a quarter paying over 50%. Rent burdens for rent-stabilized housing are over 36% of income. That's for rent-stabilized housing. Overcrowding is also somewhere between 300 and 500,000 New Yorkers live in illegal units. Basements, places where they shouldn't be living, might be dangerous because there's no other place to live. Lower income areas are losing. People talk about the 1% are doing real well. 1/10 of 1% are doing amazing. The 20 most wealthy people in this country have as much wealth as the bottom half. What you really need to know, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. What you really need to know is what the consequence of restrictions on housing supply is. What is that consequence? It is a massive subsidy to owners of existing structures. Now, I'm going to give you an example. There's a gentleman in the 70s. His name was James Harlem. In 2011, he filed a federal lawsuit. He owned a 7-unit building. 3 of them under rent stabilization. 3 of them had been deregulated, and 1 of them he occupied himself. He claimed that because his regulated tenants paid about $1,000 a month less than his unregulated tenants, he was being forced to subsidize the regulated tenants. And this is the claim that I've heard from landlords time and time again for decades. Rent regulation and all these restrictions on our ability to charge whatever the market will bear forces us to subsidize people. Okay? Well, let's look at Harlem. $1,000 difference between his market rate tenants and his rent stabilized tenants. So he goes to federal court and says, this is a taking. The city or the state ought to pay me for this lost income. James Harmon's grandparents bought that building for $41,000 in the late 1940s. The market value of the building when he brought his lawsuit was $3 million. It went up 73-fold in value. More than twice the rate of real estate nationally and several times the rate of the stock market. Where was the taking? Who was being subsidized? Why did his brownstone go up so much in value? Because he had no competition to deal with, because the housing supply had been greatly and artificially restricted by city policies with respect to construction. The shortest path to affordable housing, frankly, is more housing. So I disagree with the mayor's program on zoning for quality and affordability. Because frankly, I think it emphasizes quality over affordability. I don't think it goes far enough. I think that if you walk down 125th Street, you see, for example, a building, which I'm pointing to over my right, which is a fairly high-rise, very nice building, many, many apartments. And then you see these low, single-story, schlocky-looking stores in some cases. Those buildings should come down. New commercial and residential space should go up. And it should be affordable. And if it requires a public subsidy, then so be it. We have to be creative, we have to be vigorous, and in this case, because of what we're facing, we have to be radical. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is a member of Community Board number 12. Richard Lewis has been chair of the Housing Committee, and he's also in the throes of what Clifton would look like, because that community is part of Community Board 12, as is Washington Heights. So Richard, I hope you'll talk to us about preservation and building affordable in the Community Board 12 area. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Let me just say that one of the most important things about this evolution of housing and preservation is that the people who live in the community, when developers show up, you must show up and give your voice. Correct? And that is very, very important, because if the community board and the borough president don't have your support for what you want, it's very easy for developers to get what they want. So, thank you for coming to this meeting, and you learn a lot. And again, use the tools here that you get to fight for what you think is inappropriate for your community. The MIA-CQA, which someone said should be RIP, is something we're going to have to live with for a while. It's a major change in housing and in the city of New York. I won't belabor what has already been discussed. I will just say that I'll give you an example of what we're going through in Broadway and Sherman. A developer rushed through his proposal. He went through his environmental assessment study, which is a major thing to tell the world that everything is good when it may not necessarily be, and it's a legal document. Usually they're very long with pictures and maps and very detailed. So that's part of what you should learn about in terms of dealing with development of your community, because that's very important. The community showed up at about close to 150 people when he gave his presentation, and virtually no one supported any part. So the community board, and I'm not speaking for the community, I'm speaking historically what we did, we passed a resolution where we wanted what was best for the community. These text amendments and these EQA and EMIH are just general documents. It's not one size fits all, and it's up to you to determine what you want in the places that you live in. So, again, I emphasize that. So, we're going to hear about, and there are going to be questions about affordability, availability, but also there's an issue of viability. You can't get, the developer has a stake in this, as well as you as tenants. We're going to talk about, and there are going to be questions, I'm sure, about displacement, which has another name called gentrification, unfortunately, and mobility. And finally, what no one has begun to discuss is an issue of infrastructure. The city has a lot of problems in terms of gas lines, energy lines, in terms of electrical lines. They're old. So you can't expect to build dense structures where you don't have sufficient power, where you don't have sufficient spaces to build them in, it becomes a problem. Finally, we do have a problem of excessive people who are going to come out of the old 421A, and they're going to have a place to live. We're talking about thousands of those people. Plus, populations of the city is going to grow. So even with this proposal, it doesn't begin to fill. It's going to be a start to fill affordable housing, but it will never be sufficient. We're talking about close to 500,000 units that we may need. So, again, let's begin the discussion. And I just will say from a technology point of view, since that is my field, there'll be other developments occurring, and I'll speak to you more about that later, in terms of your ability to use something called artificial intelligence to get more and more information and to make decisions for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Is Walter South, who's a member of Community Board 9, and he's very knowledgeable about land trust. So I hope, Walter, you'll touch a little bit on what you're doing on the community board, because you've been doing a lot on affordable housing, and also the amazing possibilities with land trust.
I basically have been a developer. I've probably developed about 1,000 units of housing, mostly low income and senior citizen housing. And I recently set up a corporation called the Trust for Affordable Housing, which I'll go into a little bit later. I think basically the housing system in this country is broke. We need some very, very basic changes. We need housing as a right and not as a means test. When we bring about these changes, we're going to then erase the conflicts that we have between landlords and tenants. Because the conflicts with the present system is built in. He has every reason to get people out of the building, and you have every reason not to be pushed out of the building. So where do you end up in court, who is, of course, controlled not by you, but by them? The key to having decent housing in this city is to own the land. And that's why I've set up the Trust for Affordable Housing. The idea of the trust is that we are going to buy sites, and we're going to build on them, we're going to lease those sites to limited equity co-ops. Those limited equity co-ops will have 3 stories of commercial on the ground floor in order to help subsidize the buildings. the running of the building. And the terms of resales, the trust, and the building itself. Because we've seen too many examples of buildings like the Mitchell Lumber program, where after 20 or 30 years, of course, they bought out their mortgages and went to market. One of the buildings in our neighborhood, Morningside Gardens, the people moved in and paid $7,500. They're now selling their apartments for $1 million. And most of the people who live there can't even afford to buy their own apartments if they were forced out. But the big, a really major question which is not being addressed anywhere in the city is climate change. It's no accident that we are seeing this increase of storms, the fires that took place in Canada recently, burned down nearly the whole city, is a result of climate change. And our housing has to start addressing that also. And that's the problem with a lot of the current housing, is we're going to need new structures that address the problem of climate change. The other big problem that we're facing is segregation. We have a perfectly segregated society. That's why we have cities like Ferguson. That's why we have cities like Flint. We have to start living differently. We have to start living in buildings which are segregated, integrated economically. And when we do that, we'll break down segregation by race. Also, we need buildings which are perpetually affordable. This is, rent control is basically garbage here. And it works, but it's a struggle between those who have it and those who do not have it. And if housing was a right rather than a means test, we then could have a society which everybody could afford to live peacefully.
Thank you very much. So, you kindly said that later on you talk about solutions, and that's a challenge, but I think that's what the audience wants to hear. And there are some, so I'd love to hear. One of the issues, of course, does ZQA help us with senior housing in any way? Because I know a lot of seniors need housing. And I know that at least in the Manhattan, there are about 4 senior buildings where seniors do live, perhaps under 202, where there are parking lots. And those senior nonprofits do want to build on their parking lots. And that would be one example, 100% affordable on a parking lot next to a senior building that is run by a nonprofit. That would be an example of a solution that could come about because of ZQA. But I'd love to hear other ideas. The City Council has been wrestling with trying to get attorneys to preserve housing in housing court. That would be another possible solution, but that has not happened yet. And of course, how does the mandatory program look? I know in Broadway Sherman, Richard knows this, that particular building, as an example, whatever the amount of stories, it exists in the future because it's now in the City Council's realm. But there's an issue. 20% will definitely be low income affordable. However, we want it to be 50%. And guess what? That 30%, which is between 50 and 20, my math is not that bad, will not necessarily be permanent. That's a big problem. That 50% needs to be permanently affordable at whatever the AMI is. So these are some of the issues that I could raise a long list. You could do a larger one. But I want to thank you because you had a lot to do with the discussions over the last year or so. So what do you think you could help us add to in terms of solutions to some of this housing crisis?
Well, so let me just talk about let me sort of talk about 2 things. One is just how important, this sounds like this is a cop-out to say, but how important community involvement is in the zoning process and the zoning conversation. It's going to be happening in tens of neighborhoods around the city, including East Harlem, probably sort of later on in West Harlem, Inwood. Getting the city to commit to the right amount. Getting the city to. Is this working?
Yeah.
Getting the city to commit to the right balance of potential new development with the right amount of the right percentage of affordable housing, and then as importantly, at the right levels of affordability. One of the things which has really changed in the conversation over the last few years is that not too many years ago, the city government said, building affordable housing. And people said, great, affordable, that's a good thing. In recent years, we've come to understand just what a wide range of incomes affordable can mean, and that, you know, affordable can be 160% of the area median income, or affordable can be 30% of the area median income. And guess what? Most people in New York City who need affordable housing are much closer to the 30% of the area median income, are earning much lower rates. And it is, the city has to sort of be dragged kicking and screaming here because it is more expensive for them and more difficult for them to create the really deeply affordable units. But it is sort of strong community voice, it is sort of a community activism that is sort of brought them to the table on this, and that in every rezoning is going to hopefully work out these issues so that they are balanced in a way where it is a net benefit for stability and affordability.
And where else might there be rezonings? I mentioned two, but are there others around the city?
So, I mean, there's going to be quite a number in the next number of years. You know, right now in Staten Island, Bay Street is one that just went down actually in Flushing, in Queens. Bush Street is going to be coming up. There's a bunch that are going to be coming. And again, if there's a lot of community involvement and there's a hell of a fight to make them the right rezonings, they can be worthwhile. If there isn't, they are less likely to be the rezoning that the neighborhood actually needs to be more, you know, stable and affordable. One thing that I wanted to mention, though, we all talked about solutions. So it's really important to talk about rezoning. It's important to talk about sort of the tools to build new affordable housing that will be permanently affordable. But we all know that most of the affordable housing we have in this city is in rent-stabilized, privately held buildings, and that is under threat as it has never been before. The amount of displacement pressure that often just crosses the line to straight up harassment, where landlords are aggressively pushing tenants out, is at unprecedented levels, and that is irreplaceable affordable housing, and that's where we sort of have that's a supply that we can most cost effectively try to preserve. One of the things that is going to need a sort of a strong community conversation about is something that the administration promised the community called a citywide certificate of no harassment policy. And the idea there is that the reason harassment is taking place, right, the reason they're trying to push low rent paying tenants out of rent stabilized buildings is because they want to dramatically increase the rent, right? How do they dramatically increase the rent?
Yes.
They dramatically increase the rent through a loophole in the rent law called an individual apartment improvement increase, right? All right, what can you do, right? That's just the nature of the market. We are powerless in the face of this. Well, we're actually not, because there is often a government step there that for the landlord to do that work, right, to rehabilitate the apartments, to justify that double, tripling, and quintupling the rent, they need to get a permit from the Department of Buildings, right? And the city has control over that. So the idea of a certificate of no harassment policy is that there be a system in place across the city where if a landlord is applying for a Department of Buildings permit to do major work in an apartment or a building, they first have to pass through a filter that shows that they have not been harassing tenants out of their building. And if they have not been harassing tenants, if there's no evidence that they've been harassing, they go through the regular process, no muss, no fuss. But if there is evidence, or there is a credible allegation of harassment, then the building is pulled out, and they have to show that they have not been harassing tenants, or if they have to make up for it by providing affordable housing in that building. Right? So that's really sort of a key mechanism that the city government has in its control that a couple months ago the mayor publicly committed to implementing, and is going to be sort of getting to the point soon of negotiating what the details are. And you know, the mayor would like this to be less of a fight with the real estate lobby, and so a little bit of a weaker policy. And I think from the tenants' points of view, we want a hell of a fight with the real estate lobby, because this needs to be a strong policy. This is the main mechanism by which we are losing most of our affordable housing, and the administration needs to hear really hard from communities like this one that this policy has to be in place, and it has to be the right policy.
I just want to be clear, this is really important. And if you could take one takeaway today would be to contact your council member or contact the mayor in a letter asking him that you want a certificate of no harassment as a policy. It exists. It exists in Clinton Hell's Kitchen. There is precedent. It works. Tim, also, how do we'll get there in a second. Well, Tim, we're going to go right down the line. Tim, can you just talk a little bit also about preservation preservation and some of your ideas to follow up on what we asked earlier.
Well, I actually take a more radical and in some ways perhaps simplistic view of these things. I think that the city should use its condemnation power. I think it should do kind of micro condemnations to take sites and actually put up housing. I think we need to fight to bring programs like Mitchell-Lama back, that we need more public housing, and that people have to understand that you can't walk down a major street in New York in the evening without stepping over a homeless person. There's times when we have to recognize the crisis for what it is. So I'm, being a little blunt, I think Benjamin has a far more sophisticated grasp about how this could be implemented in terms of, zoning changes, no harassment, that sort of thing. I would add to that that the city has to be prepared to use its condemnation power and say, look, if you guys aren't going to do what we will, whatever we need for state resources, hopefully federal resources will go after those.
Thank you. Walter, you wanted to jump in?
I want to say something about the term affordability. There are a lot of people in this country who think that Moses handed down the rule of affordability, and that 30% of the housing, 30% of your income should be a recent and decent amount to pay for your housing. But if you take a look at what's going on in Europe, you'll find that what they think affordability is like 21%. So why are we paying 30% in this country, when in Europe they're paying 21%? And on top of that, they're probably getting better housing. That's why I keep saying the system is broken. All this struggle about harassment, it's built into the system. It's going to happen. Because he has every incentive in the world to get rid of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Richard, go ahead.
We also need to look at vacant land, vacant lots, and there's a lot up there. Vacant land and vacant lots. We are doing a study on that in our community district and finding that there are a lot of public lands that are available, but also private land that's available that people are speculating on where we can use that. Perhaps, and this is a little radical suggestion, it has its own problems, if we have a crisis, perhaps eminent domain may be a tool to encourage development in those areas where there are sizable lots. They may not be together, may be scattered. We need to solve this problem with looking at these vacant lots and many of the parking lots that are there. And perhaps the community land trust might be kind of a tool for that purpose. On the issue of certificate of harassment and other laws, the big issue is enforcement.
Yes.
And I think that is something that has to be seriously remedied. Because developers know that government is very slow in responding to your complaints. So I think that is where the problem exists. And that's something that has to be worked on. And a third, perhaps a radical suggestion is the so-called housing court must be reformed in every detail and every step. They are trying, but it has been very, very slow. You want something that you can go to the court virtually to sue your landlord for what he's doing to you. It's not built that way. So that is another thing that may be looked at for better protection and better tenant protection. As you well know, there are state agencies, there are federal agencies, and they're very slow in giving you the remedies that you want.
And legal counsel.
Tim wanted to add something. Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, if you go up and down Lexington Avenue and other parts of the city, you often see a lot of commercial spaces with empty residential spaces above them, not being used. I think the city needs to look at the possibility of penalizing owners who don't use those spaces for the intended purposes by basically saying that they are using the building in a way that is inconsistent with a certificate of occupancy, so that there's some kind of penalty that can be imposed for owners who continually keep those otherwise usable units off the market.
Great idea. have a question, Benjamin, also. We didn't talk much about senior housing under ZQA, and I think that's of interest to the audience. So can you help describe if you think ZQA is going to produce senior housing, for how long, and whether it works or not?
Yes. It's an alphabet soup on all the zoning policy changes. We've mostly been talking about mandatory inclusionary housing, right, which is where when they upzone it, allow a landlord to build more market rate housing, that you've got to build some percent of affordable housing, and sort of what that is and where that is sort of what's been contested. The other thing that Gail is referring to is zoning for quality and affordability, ZQA, which is a smaller set of rule changes that sort of adjust a little bit how both what the rules are for certain types of housing, particularly for senior housing. Stepping back a bit, senior housing, affordable senior housing is a huge problem now, and it's going to get a hell of a lot worse. Right now, there's about 1 million senior citizens in New York City who are disproportionately very low income. Right? So it's already a serious problem. By 2030, our city is expected to grow quite a bit, and about 230,000 of the new people affected to be in the city are going to be additional senior citizens. So our senior housing, affordable housing problem now is serious, and it is getting a lot worse. The city absolutely needs to do something to help to address that. One thing is to do every single thing they can to preserve the existing and stabilize and the existing government-backed housing, which is what we've been talking about. The other is to use city subsidy to create new government-backed senior housing developments. But the other is to use their zoning tools to better encourage the development of senior housing. So one of the things that was in those zoning for quality and affordability rules is that in certain types of neighborhoods, if you are building new affordable senior housing, that you get something of a density bump. You get to build a little bit higher, encouraging that to be the thing that gets built rather than standard market housing, and that you are not required to build in as much car parking in that building. It reduces construction costs. It's controversial. Some neighborhoods think it's the best thing in the world. Some neighborhoods think it really is out of step with sort of the way they use cars. Some neighborhoods are concerned that there's too much it potentially creates too much development. So there's a lot of conversation back and forth around it. From our point of view, our sort of fundamental position is that if there's going to be zoning changes, they need to be fundamentally premised on the idea that it creates better housing and more affordable housing for people, and we think that the zoning for quality and affordability rules in the main did that. So I do think that those new rules will meaningfully produce some new senior housing, and it's not going to solve the problem, but it will produce more units, and as part of an overall city effort that is focused on using every single tool at their disposal and creating a bunch of new ones, it could be
We just have to make sure it's permanent. Go ahead, Richard, you want to say something? We're going to go to the audience in a minute, so think of your questions. Not quite yet. Go ahead. It's on. It's on.
There is a supportive feature with senior housing. We should remember that. That is, seniors have aged, and they may need certain services, and they should be located perhaps nearby or virtually in the building itself. So when you speak about senior housing, I think you should bear that in mind. And also, someone should pay for that or support it somehow. Another thing is, I think the BSA and the ZQA was strengthened so that landlords or developers could not claim hardship and therefore say that they needed to sell the building itself. This has occurred in senior citizen housing, and this is a very serious problem when it does. So we need to be mindful of that prospect as well.
Thank you, Reverend. Also, the question I have is land trust. Can you just help us to describe what a land trust is and why you think it might be helpful for the future for affordable housing?
Sure. A land trust is actually a corporation, a nonprofit corporation, which buys land. And the reason they buy land is to take it off the market. And then they lease this land to a limited equity co-op and they build on that site limited equity co-op apartments. I know two things I would like to say is also about fact is, I did the 197A for Community Board 9, and I walked every block in Community Board 9, and made a list of every site where you could go, and believe you me, there are.
I know that's something, I just want people to understand what's available out there. So even if you don't live in Inwood, which is being zoned differently, shall we say, if you don't live in East Harlem, which is being zoned differently, shall we say, you can still participate in the issue of what will my neighborhood look like if there's a building in the neighborhood that's going to get a special permit. We talked a little bit about the zoning and the changes for senior housing, and that's going to be when there's a space and there's a developer who wants to build it, or if I had my way, a nonprofit. But wanted, if you don't mind, Benjamin, just a little bit about a special permit, because that could impact you in your neighborhood, not for seniors, not necessarily in the upzone area, but where there's a change in zoning.
Sure, I mean, so most of the conversation is about the why rezonings, but as our president said, a lot of change happens because developers go for a special permit, where they want to take the existing zone, the existing use of a building, and be allowed to do something else. And the exact same rules, the exact same public benefits that should be required, and where there should be serious oversight on the large neighborhood-wide rezonings, absolutely have to be there in the smaller buildings as well, the special permit zones. The problem is that those are often go under the radar. Notice goes in the paper and it's an officially public notice, but there isn't quite as much attention on it to really hold the decision makers accountable. And so keeping an eye on that, working with local community groups, keeping an eye on that, working with our president, working with the community board, and keeping that as a focus so that the administration is accountable for all their decisions is important.
Go ahead, sir. Question?
My name is Daniel Carpin, professional engineer.
Stand back a little bit if you could. Okay.
I do energy conservation engineering. Monday and Tuesday of this week, there was a conference on passive housing, building housing that does not have heating systems to cut costs.
What's your question?
The question is, will you be at Wednesday's hearing at the City Council, the revising the Energy Conservation Construction Code, and push for passive construction on all new buildings in the city of New York, so that if the heat fails, the building still stays warm?
Okay, so I can answer that really quickly. You can sit down, but we can answer that. The issue is passive housing. A lot of us have heard about the need to make buildings green, and others can talk about this on the panel. But the passive housing was actually a resolution that passed the borough board of the borough of Manhattan. And that includes all the community boards and all of the elected officials in terms of the city council and the borough president. And there was just a conference on this topic. And passive housing means that the entire building is not just the ways in which the heating system operates, but the entire building needs to look at ways of being environmentally efficient. You could note that the building being built on Roosevelt Island by Cornell Technion is going to be a passive house. It is a concept that we would like to see, to be honest with you, in every building being built in the city of New York. And this resolution that just passed the borough board is the first of hopefully many that will make a big difference. And I want to thank all the community boards who voted for it. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in on this topic. Okay, next.
I'm just wondering if...
You have to stand back a little bit.
I'm just wondering if some of the buildings that are being closed, like hospitals and schools and prisons and such like, I understand even the police department out in Brooklyn has been a landmark status. They're talking about tearing it down. I wondered if any of those things could be converted to housing for the homeless. And it seems like the world is changing, hospitals are closing, and now we have urgent care centers.
No, I think that's a very good question. I have something to say, but others might. Anybody else want to comment on that?
Yes, I think the answer to that is that's actually an important thing, right? So part of what's changed in the way the city builds affordable housing is that if you think of sort of the big city affordable housing production programs of 20, 30 years ago, those were mostly based in city-owned land. There's a lot of highly distressed housing, there's a lot of vacant land. There is far less of that now. There are some that we might be able to use creative strategies to try to sort of extract from the market. but there's a lot less than just strict single living. The city can, give a developer a buck to build affordable housing and do it affordable. One of the creative solutions to that is that there are a lot of underutilized publicly held sites, such as libraries, maybe precincts, other things like that, where the city has the land. There is something valuable on it, but you can potentially, sort of rezone it, build something, sort of build a taller building with a lot of affordable housing, put the library back on the ground floor, put the precinct back on the ground floor, and that's where on those publicly held sites, the city has more control to guarantee more and deeper affordability. So it's an important thing to note.
The only thing I would just add, and this may sound a little outrageous to a number of people, but we have places like, what I think is federal now, is Floyd Bennett Field. I think that what we need is an emergency reserve of transitional housing that is publicly supplied. I know in Europe they've done amazing things. Now this may gross you out a little bit, but they take shipping crates, which are actually huge, like little mobile homes, and they retrofit them. And they put in all kinds of systems so people have a nice little place to live for a time. Put 50, 100,000 of those into Floyd Bennett Field, get social services, get bus.
National Park Service.
Well, they could, another place, if we have to go to another place, I'm not sure that all Floyd Bennett Field is governed by National Park.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
I stand corrected. Find another place for it.
There are a lot of distressed areas in terms of these lots and where these buildings exist. An example of perhaps encouraging development in that area is to either have a park, and you notice what happened in the High Line. There are other areas where the city is trying to put in structures to encourage development. So yes, some of these houses and some of these public areas should be used again.
How to pay attention. So right now, as we speak, Beth Israel, which is owned by Mount Sinai now, wants to move from its current location. I know it's not in Harlem, but it's 16th Street, east side. Short version, everybody's focused on what the hospital should look like in the future on 14th Street, but guess what I'm focused on? What's happened to the land where the hospital is now? And that would be an example of whatever is in your neighborhood. I know there's some discussions around St. Louis. What is going to happen to that space? Because with all due respect to the nonprofit community, and I'm a big supporter of the nonprofit community, many nonprofits want to sell for the highest condo price and then put that dollars towards their mission. Well, that's great, but what about the rest of us who have so little land? And we would like to see a restrictive, no, this is a bad word in today's, restrictive declaration, restrictive covenant on that land so that it stays affordable for housing. So these are fights. These are amazing fights. And if there's one in your neighborhood in terms of any kind of a nonprofit that you think might be selling, you need to get right in there, as others have stated, and be part of the discussion with the community board. Because even the nonprofit sector is as challenged as some developers in terms of wanting to sell for the highest bidder. It's a problem. Go ahead.
Ms. Gwen Black, and professional artist. One of the things that have not been addressed is about the plight. Nothing has really been addressed, I think, enough for artists here in the community. Many of us have been pushed out, we're aging, and we cannot afford to live in the community anymore. So what can be done, or what is being done, Gail, to help us artists to stay in the community and not be pushed out?
Everybody want to go ahead?
I just got back from Cuba, and one of the reasons we went was to see a lot of artists in Cuba. And one of the things that I came away with from that trip is I think that 10% of my building should be for artists.
Thank you. I mean, I think that the art space at the school in East Harlem is an example. 90 affordable units, seriously affordable, and wonderful below market art space. I can tell you that in NoHo Soho, again, artist space is supposed to exist, and owners have switched it to I rent or they want to. So we are now in the Borough President's office on a rampage campaign, whatever you want to call it, when owners come in, and certainly we know how this works, the zoning wants to be changed, they want to change the zoning to residential, and people forget that that first floor has always been for manufacturing or artist space. So We're not letting them do that anymore. Now, I have to say, we're also desperate to get the fight for every single unit for the artists. So on this, we'll let you know that it's very high on our agenda. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Francesca Castellanos, and I know these landlords need to be thinking about seconding their, like,
With respect to warehousing, and I know there's been efforts in the past to control warehousing that have failed, and I think they might have failed for some legal reasons. But the approach that I would take is that if for a period of time a certain percentage of buildings are kept, units are kept off the market in a particular building, so that the certificate of occupancy that says, you know, all right, this is a 30-unit building, but in fact only 20 units are being occupied, I would say that at some point that could be considered a violation of the certificate of occupancy, which is granted not just to permit occupancy, but in contemplation that there will actually be occupancy. So some kind of fine, you know, perhaps progressive fine on the part of the city to those owners who, you know, keep units off the market either out of neglect or out of some, you know, long-term strategy.
Just one quick, we have to be very careful about vacancy and in terms of rent regulations. If the vacancies are very high, very low, that may affect the Emergency Tenant Protection Act. So I think we should be very, it has to be a balanced approach because getting full vacancy versus not enough vacancy. That is a 5% level or something.
Well, perhaps I should respond to that. The Emergency Tenant Protection Act, rent stabilization in the city of New York automatically is discontinued if the citywide vacancy rate goes above 5%. We are now a little over 3%. Historically, we fluctuated from 2 to 3% for the last 40 or 50 years. If we got to 5%, it would mean that there's a lot more housing. I think that the 5% rate is probably too low. Maybe the law should be changed. Nationwide, vacancy rates are between 8 to 10%, and historically around 10% in normal functioning markets. That would be a big legislative battle. But I do think, and this is very important, that there is a sort of an intellectual justification for rent protections based upon scarcity, which is why we can go out and say to owners, no, you have unusual artificial levels of bargaining leverage as long as the vacancy rate is this low. But we recognize that if we get to a functioning market, if there is, if housing is plentiful, then we will come out of it. I think there has to be that kind of threshold because it justifies the kind of protections we have. And I'll say one other thing because a lot of people don't understand this. Rent regulation, rent stabilization, although we describe it as the greatest source of housing affordability, is not really an affordability program. Rent regulation is about market fairness. It's to make sure that your rent is fairly calibrated to what a normal market might produce. And that should be the case whether you're a millionaire or whether you know, make $5,000 a year. You should be able to pay $1,200 for an apartment that's worth $1,200.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm a tenant leader for the YMCA building. We sort of live together at one time. Our building is an HDFC. We're rental, we're rent stabilized. We have a situation going on where formerly the former owners have the City Development Corporation. Now the building's in flux, going into Alizé management. Unfortunately, they share one great thing, I guess, that they're both on the landlord's worst landlord's watch list from your colleague, the Public Advocate's Office. So let's just say we haven't been happy for a while. And my question is, we're an HDFC that's rental, and we never had the opportunity to own. So is that ship has sailed now that it's going into another ownership? The building is also scheduled for landmarking as well. So we just are at a point, there's 24 units. I think Mr. South had spoken about having that distinction of having floors that were commercial space. And the YMCA has moved out. They had a wonderful sweetheart deal, and they were a great co-tenant with us. We don't have that protection. So what we want to know is what would our options be? We understand we're rent stabilized, but again, that can also be very tricky and manipulated. So we just want to help on that. Thank you.
I don't know the answer to that, but I'll give you some numbers and who call organizations that are more experts in this.
And I think what you're saying is that those of us who are elected, we will all work with you. Rosalba Rodriguez is here. Tina Moore from the director of the office. Rosalba is the assistant who will work with you. And I'm sure Valente will kick ass to support you.
Yes, it's been great. They've come to our building. It's just that I want to put that out there.
I think it's really
because-
good that you mentioned it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not every not-for-profit is equal.
Exactly.
So, in this case, they had, religious protection as well as a corporation, and we're in flux right now.
We will work
All
with
right,
you.
thank you so
very
much.
much.
Thank you.
Next.
How you doing? My name is Tyrone Anthony. I'm the NACP Housing Chair. And in respect to all y'all who asked these questions, and I think Mr. Richard Lewis brought it up, who oversees the young harassment? Is it HPD or the particular agency that oversees that particular certificate of harassment when a tenant has already been, the tenant's already found a landlord guilty of harassment? Who enforces to stop the landlord from doing so?
Thank you. Good question.
So there are very few protections against tenants who are being harassed. There were almost none a couple of years ago, right? So this new law that we're talking about, the ability to sue your landlord in housing court, came from a big tenant fight, right? So it's a big tenant movement that said we need a law so that instead of just them suing us, we can sue them for harassment, right? And that sort of came from a tenant campaign to create this tenant protection act. It is imperfect. It is a lot. It requires a lot of tenant activism, and HPD, the city housing agency, has been a little bit soft in aggressively pursuing it. So the short answer to your question is technically it's supposed to be the state housing agency, which is the HCR, and then all for certain types of state complaints, right? Because they're the ones who oversee rent laws mostly. But now, in the last couple of years, the city housing agency, HPD, also has authority over harassment with this new Tenant Protection Act law. But the truth is, neither one of them does it in a very aggressive fashion. Neither one of them takes it really seriously. And so there needs to be aggressive activism by tenants and to work with their local leaders to get them to stand up. There is a law in housing court, right, which says you can sue your landlord for harassment.
That's the new law.
Meets the threshold, but then there's also going to be something that is even newer, more automatic, called the single-line certificate of no harassment. And if we have not passed it, we can fight to win, so that if your landlord is pushing you out to get a vacancy, so they can just prevent it overnight, that we can make it harder for them to make it automatic for the Department of Buildings to deny them a permit.
Just to be clear, the first one is law, the second one is pending.
Correct.
Tim wanted to add.
Let me just add to that. I have calls in my office almost every day. The landlord is harassing me. You got your boss. I got some magazines, I got some newspapers. Well, yeah, well, I got stacks here and stacks there. And, well, what do you mean? Well, I got a space. I can walk through it. I took the consultation fee, which is $300. I slid it back across the desk, and I said, listen, do yourself a favor. Go out and hire somebody to come in and help clean your apartment. The landlord probably won't bother you, and you'll be happy. He called me a week later and said, Mr. Collins, you're a genius. My apartment never looked better, and the landlord's not bothering me. So sometimes you got to put things in perspective. And I know there's very serious harassment that goes on.
Yes, it is.
But there are a lot of other ways to address the problems in terms of other laws that are, I think, more protective. And certificates of no harassment are certainly something we're supporting in terms of building.
So this will be the last question, and then we'll start with Walter in terms of final comments. And I think we've learned a lot about ZQA and MIH, talked about preservation, and given everybody some marching orders as to what we have to pay attention to for the future. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, Cesare Paco from ProPublica. I just want to touch on the tax breaks because they're a big part of this picture and we haven't talked about that much. We've been collecting stories from tenants for the last year about their experiences renting New York City. One of the most amazing things you read in there is the big difference that knowing about a J51 abatement or exemption can make in tenants' lives. I hear, when I talk to tenants, I hear about 5-fold reductions in rents. I hear about large overcharge awards or triple damages. You hear about people being able to avoid illegal evictions or huge double-digit rent increases. The biggest problem with all of that is just that a lot of these tenants just don't know that they even live in an apartment that is in a building that's receiving a J51, and even though the DHCR seems to know exactly which apartments these are, there doesn't seem to be any effort at the agency to tell these tenants that they live in one of these apartments, even in the wake of the Roberts decision. So I'm just wondering if any of you think this is a problem. If so, what should be done about it?
It should be in the lease, a line stating, this apartment is a J51.
I understand the issue. I also want to put in a plug for ProPublica because they are doing a lot of series and there's also collaboration with the Daily News and they're giving the kind of in-depth journalism that other publications don't. So if you want to look online for ProPublica, you should do so because there's a lot of good information. So we wanted to add to that. Does anybody want to jump in about this issue?
I have people calling my office all the time that, they're getting evicted, they don't think they're rent regulated. We look at the records and, oh, this is J51. It's a serious problem. It's widespread. I thought the HCR was doing some outreach on this, but apparently it hasn't been significant.
It's gotta be in the red.
I would like to,
Hold on one second.
you have to know it all. I would just like to take the time, thanking you all for coming out, as I live in, how you say, DHSCR. But I take offense that I'm here and I'm a Harlem resident all my life. That's 52 years. Don't know nowhere else to go. And there's no protection for tenants where we have legal counsel to represent us.
Right.
And no one's saying anything. I thank Palanto for having this forum, but they need to add for New York City Housing Authority tenants and our rights. I mean, 40 years I paid into this apartment, and I'm being kind of labeled as undesirable. Why? Because I'm not going to roll over, just let you run over me?
Yep.
So your question is about legal counsel.
And to implement in your forum, when I think of maybe next year possibly, let's add NYCHA to this also.
That's right. That's
That's
right.
why I always just, I want to,
I'm not saying anything, I'm just sitting here, just taking it all in, but I really feel excluded.
thank you very much.
The one yesterday was NYCHA residents. We had NYCHA representative here as well. You have legal counsel for everyone, so that is applied for everyone. FYI.
So why don't we conclude with wonderful, Walter, do you want to add some concluding remarks and then Richard?
Well, I think I've been very clear. I think the system rots and it needs to be changed.
Richard?
Let me just say that in terms of technology, there is some major steps being taken to deal with the issue of enforcement and the social J51. You all are familiar with Siri. Well, there is an improvement of that where artificial intelligence, and it's going to be announced pretty soon, where you can have a personal assistant that will connect, just like your apps on your phone, vocally to a lot of other servers and give you information, so that there will be a conversation and a talk with you, and a lot of developers are pursuing that. So a lot of the way we're looking at the world today is going to change. The software is called VIV, V-I-V. I'm not plugging it, but it's a major development in terms of, again, your virtual personal assistant to give you direct answers. So you can check on Google to see what it is. So perhaps this notion of enforcement will be better served for better links with other agencies in terms of J51 and other answers to be given to you.
Thank you very much.
I just thank you all for coming and thank Palanti again for doing a wonderful program and staying involved.
Thank the panel, they were fabulous, you're a great audience, thank you, Palanti. working to really preserve and build affordable housing in the city of New York. Thank you all.
¿Perdón? Ok, dale este botoncito. That's good, it's recording. The only call somebody has to monitor.
¿Tú eres el que va a traducir?
Yeah, ¿me oye?
Sí.
Okay.
Interpretar, traducir es verbal.
¿Cómo es?
Good afternoon again, everyone. Buenas tardes a todos. Las personas que necesitan traducción, por favor, asegúrense de ir a la mesa donde está Huáscar para que le den los cositos del oído. ¿Usted entiende? Otra cosa, estamos haciendo housekeeping antes de comenzar este taller. If we could keep this line open here, because it's going to be the Q&A. If you have questions, we have a Q&A session at the end of the session. So we can just have it open so people can sit in and it would not disrupt anyone. A las personas, ¿qué se van a hacer las preguntas? Ustedes pueden hacer su pregunta en español, se la traducimos en inglés. Y es importante que esta línea aquí se quede clara para que así no callemos ni tropecemos ni nada. ¿Tiene sentido? Ok. Muchos de ustedes ya me conocen, a lot of you already know me. Mi nombre es Elcia Vázquez, yo soy la fundadora y directora de Palante Harlem. That sounds really good in Spanish. That's the first time I did that in Spanish. You did that? And I thought I was speaking in English. It was Spanish, right? It was Spanish, right? Yeah. So I'm Elsie Vasquez. I'm the founder and executive director of Palante Harlem. I'm very happy to see everyone here today. Some of you guys are new today. You did not attend yesterday's session. So I'm really happy for those that actually came back to continue the sessions of workshops that we have. So for those of you that this is your first time, this is Palante's annual housing conference. And we've been doing this for quite some time, but every year it gets bigger. So last year it was 2 days, now it's 3 days. And our goal really is to cover every area of housing. And the name of the conference is called Demystifying Housing. So whatever programs that you attend, if people are not being transparent to you, the speakers, or if I'm not being transparent to you, you gotta let me know, because that's the word demystify. We gotta take the myth out and talk about the fact. And the reason why we do this every year is to make sure that you guys understand what's going on here. Not just in Harlem, not just in Washington Heights, citywide. And we're able to do these conferences. This year we're actually offering over 40 workshops. Last year we delivered over 30. So the goal here is that if you live in a city-owned building, if you live in a NYCHA, project-based Section 8, rent stabilized, if you're a homeowner, if you live in an HDC and you're a shareholder, there are tracks of workshops that you're supposed to attend, and we believe that by you attending all those sessions, you will receive the tools that you need to protect you in your home. Simultaneous to the workshops, there are also legal clinics. There are attorneys coming in and out. The attorneys are focused around wills, trusts, and estates, housing, immigration, and labor. Why? Because we need to make sure we cover those areas as well. And so you will be able, on the 8th floor, you're able to speak one-on-one to attorneys. There's also a track of workshops that most of you should have registered. And last but not least, the people, the amount of agencies are here today, just here to help you. They're giving you tchotchkes. Don't take those tchotchkes for granted. Talk to them. Like the Red Cross is here, HPD, everybody's here, Department of Health is here. So make sure you take the opportunity to thank them when you go back upstairs for their service. You know, they don't have to be here, and I know they're going to be here tomorrow as well. That being said, a lot of you guys know that I love to speak, so I'll just shut up, okay? It's repetition, you know, that's what part of training is about. And if you have any questions, you know, feel free to give us a call or see me at the end of the session. It's been brought to my attention, however, that there are people from different organizations that are trying to record this session. We would like for them to just identify themselves and let us know. The folks should have been registered. Everyone here should be registered. And at no point in time should people be recording people's cases without their consent. So we're a little bit upset about that. So if you're here, please stop and listen. It's going to be a wonderful workshop. Now to this panel, our jefa, Gail Brewer, is the moderator. Un aplauso.
Thank you very much. It is an honor to be here with Alcia and her amazing crew. You know, it takes a lot of people to make this happen, and I want to thank all of Palente, from those who made the packets, to those who did the food, to those who got us all here. So big round of applause. So we have a great panel. I'll introduce them in a minute. And the purpose of this workshop, I think it's called Affordable Housing Post MIH and ZQA, and that basically stands for Mandatory Inclusionary Housing and Zoning Quality Housing. And I will translate what that all means. In the most general sense, and this panel is so expert on this topic, it means how do we preserve what we have that is affordable? That's a challenge in itself. And how do we build affordable? And of course, affordable for whom are all the questions. How tall is the building is always Gail Brewer's question. And it's a challenge because I don't want all of Manhattan or the whole city to be, you know, devoid of light and air. So these are some of the very tough questions that we're asking. Now, as you know, the mandatory inclusionary zoning and mandatory inclusionary housing, which basically means if a building is eligible for a zoning change, then it has to have affordable housing, or if it gets a special permit, which is the one reason that I supported the MIH, then must include affordable housing. There's lots of issues though, because it doesn't have to be as much housing as I would like. 20% would be the minimum. It has to be permanent, which is good. It has to be there as long as the building is there. Because in the past, we would end up with affordable housing for as long as the building had some kind of a tax abatement. And I don't know about you, but in my life, 20, 30 years go very quickly. Before you know it, people are being told, oh, I'm so sorry, the tax abatement has run out and you are now a market rate tenant. So that under MIH won't happen. But the building's not going to be tall, because then the owner of the building wants to subsidize the affordable units with a market rate in the building. So these are the issues that are of great concern. The ZQA was changed a lot when it was passed, and it does include senior housing, although the permanent issue is still a challenge. So we spent about a year in our office working with many of the groups here, certainly the community board, trying to figure out the best changes that were possible under these two programs. Again, this is not the only program that exists, but it's something that is being discussed. The East Harlem community has just had a very extensive neighborhood input plan, and you can find that online. They really did think, where should the affordable housing go? Where should the school go? Where should there be a park? Where should there be a community garden? And where should there be a cultural center? So the East Harlem example is one, and I want to give Speaker Melissa Mark-Riverito and others a lot of credit. Inwood in the Upper Manhattan is going through right now, about to start the same process. We've pushed in our office to make sure that there's a process and that people who agree or disagree get to be part of the process for this housing effort. I also want to mention, you know, and up in the, right near the cloisters, there's a park and there's a building going up. It'll be the first one. It's called Broadway Sherman. And it will be the first example of a building that goes in under MIH. Not perfect. It could have been 27 stories. It probably will be 15 stories, which is still, Gail Brewer does not love tall buildings in residential areas, I'll be honest with you. However, it will be hopefully 50% affordable, and that's a big change from the past when we wouldn't have any affordable housing. So these are some of the very, very small number of challenges that we face. Of course, I haven't even talked about preservation. I know we'll hear about it from some of our amazing speakers. So I would first like to introduce Benjamin Dolce, which is, he's way over to my right, and he is head of the Association of Neighborhood Housing Developers. This is an organization, and he will explain it better than I can, but they are an umbrella organization that think about policy issues, how to preserve and build affordable housing. And they have done extensive maps and analysis of what